The palace was silent in the early morning, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and floors, carrying whispers of decades past. Royal Guard Thomas Calder moved quietly down the north corridor, his boots soft against the polished marble, each step a precise echo of discipline and focus. He had walked these halls for years, learning to notice the subtle shifts in shadows, the faintest drafts that carried secrets from one room to another. Today, his duty was different. It was not simply to patrol, to ensure safety. It was to search carefully, discreetly, and with absolute determination. For reasons that weighed heavily on him, he was heading toward Camilla's private quarters. The early sunlight crept through the tall windows, casting long, sharp lines across the corridor, and Thomas felt the familiar thrill of tension tighten in his chest. Every guard had stories of restricted rooms, hidden passages, and forbidden documents. Every palace seemed to have corners where history whispered in secret tones. Camilla's suite had always carried an air of meticulous control. Nothing in her private spaces was left to chance, from the placement of her gowns to the selection of ornaments on the mantelpiece. And yet, for Thomas, instinct had been whispering for weeks that something unusual, something deeply significant, was hidden behind those elegant, unassuming doors. He approached the thick double doors of Camilla's closet with a calm, practiced exterior, though his fingers tingled with anticipation. The key to this search had been quietly secured by the king's order, following a tip that had come through discreet channels, a message that suggested that among Camilla's possessions was something of immense historical importance, something that had belonged to the late queen herself. Thomas's mind raced through the possibilities as he gently tested the lock. The familiar click sounded impossibly loud in the hushed corridor, a single note that seemed to echo off the high ceilings like a warning. The door swung open to reveal a room filled with shadows, garments hung with careful precision, rows of shoes lined with surgical order, and boxes stacked neatly along the far wall. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and polished cedar, a fragrance Camilla preferred for her clothing. Thomas stepped inside, moving with deliberate caution. His eyes scanned each corner of the closet, noting the meticulous organization, but searching for anything out of place. A misaligned hanger, a box slightly shifted. These small anomalies often led to discoveries. The deeper he stepped, the more he felt the weight of history pressing against him, a tangible presence that demanded reverence even as curiosity compelled him forward. He began with the gowns, brushing his gloved fingers lightly over silks and satins, feeling the textures, noting the labels. Every dress, every coat, every ceremonial robe was perfectly preserved. Yet Thomas knew the historical artifact he sought would not be easily visible. The tip had mentioned something that belonged to the late queen, an item of such significance it had been carefully concealed, likely for decades. He moved toward a section of the closet with heavier curtains and locked boxes stacked neatly, the kind of storage a person uses to protect secrets from casual eyes. Thomas's heart began to race, not from fear, but from the thrilling possibility of discovery. The first box he opened revealed nothing more than seasonal gloves and vintage scarves. The second contained gloves, handkerchiefs, and what looked like an unused shawl. Thomas methodically continued, each item carefully examined, each lid replaced quietly. Time seemed to stretch, the soft hum of the palace outside reduced to a distant murmur, the normal cadence of footsteps and conversation fading into silence as he delved deeper into the recesses of Camilla's private collection. And then, in the very back corner, partially hidden behind a row of floor-length coats, he saw a large, heavily padded garment bag that seemed out of place among the modern ensembles. He knelt to examine it, carefully lifting the bag onto a nearby table. Its weight was substantial, and the fabric felt unusually thick beneath his hands. A faint scent of old silk and age drifted from the zipper as he unfastened it slowly. Thomas's pulse quickened with each inch he revealed, the soft metallic sound of the zipper, a drumbeat of anticipation. Inside, carefully folded, was a robe unlike anything he had ever seen in Camilla's collection. The intricate embroidery, the sparkling threads, and the carefully sewn embellishments spoke of ceremonial importance. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as recognition struck. This was no ordinary garment. This was the late queen's coronation robe. The robe shimmered under the dim light of the closet, its gold threads catching the soft glow and highlighting delicate patterns that traced the emblematic history of the monarchy. Every stitch seemed to tell a story, every emblem a reminder of power, dignity, and legacy. Thomas ran his fingers lightly over the surface, feeling the weight of history itself. This was a treasure meant to be preserved in the palace's archives, not hidden away in a private collection, no matter how meticulous. He understood instantly the implications of what he had found. Camilla had clearly chosen to retain it, carefully concealing it where few eyes would see. The discovery was as shocking as it was delicate. Thomas's mind raced with questions. Why was the coronation robe here, among her personal belongings? How long had it been concealed? What might Camilla do if she discovered the search? And yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was no doubt about his next steps. This was a matter not merely of protocol, but of moral responsibility. The robe was an irreplaceable piece of history, a symbol of a reign that had shaped the monarchy. It belonged to the institution, to the people, and above all, it deserved to be protected from misuse or exploitation. He carefully zipped the bag back up and lifted it from the table. Moving quietly, Thomas placed it in a secure carrying case he had brought for exactly such contingencies. Each motion was deliberate, precise, designed to leave no trace of disturbance. The soft rustle of fabric, the faint metallic click of the case, seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Thomas paused for a moment, listening, ensuring that the palace remained unaware of his intrusion. Then he retraced his steps, moving with the same careful precision he had always employed in corridors filled with history, secrecy, and subtle threats. Before exiting, Thomas took one final look around Camilla's closet. Every coat hung perfectly, every shoe in its place, and yet the empty space where the robe had lain now held a quiet significance. It was a reminder that even within the most meticulously maintained private quarters, secrets could be hidden. But more importantly, it was proof that diligence, observation, and the instincts of a loyal guard could uncover truths that others might wish to remain buried. Thomas exhaled quietly, lifting the carrying case with the robe to his side. The palace seemed to hold its breath alongside him as he moved back toward the exit, each step measured, each heartbeat echoing the gravity of what he had just found. As he emerged into the corridor, the faint morning sunlight highlighted the polished floors, the glimmer of chandeliers, and the quiet bustle of staff beginning their day. For a moment, Thomas allowed himself a small sense of relief. The discovery was complete. The robe, the late queen's coronation garment, was now secure, in trusted hands, and ready to be returned to its rightful place. But he knew the ripple effects would follow quickly. Secrets of such magnitude rarely remained hidden for long, and the revelation of this one would undoubtedly send shockwaves through the palace, testing loyalties, igniting whispers, and stirring ambitions long kept in check. Thomas Calder adjusted the strap of the carrying case across his shoulder and walked toward the king's private office, each step purposeful, every detail recorded in his memory. This was more than a simple retrieval. It was an act that balanced duty, history, and morality. Somewhere behind the polished doors of the palace, Camilla would sense the shift in power, the subtle correction of an imbalance she had attempted to create. And somewhere within him, Thomas carried the satisfaction and the burden of having uncovered one of the most closely guarded secrets in the royal household. The coronation robe, a symbol of legacy and continuity, had been found, and for now, it was safe. The palace corridors seemed quieter than usual as Thomas carried the secured case containing the coronation robe toward the king's private office. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting elongated reflections across the marble floors. But the usual chatter of staff and distant footsteps felt muted, as though the building itself sensed the weight of the discovery. Every step Thomas took was deliberate, measured, and careful, ensuring that the precious cargo remained untouched and unseen. He knew that any slip could alert Camilla, whose attentiveness to detail was legendary, and whose ability to manipulate situations had kept secrets like this hidden for years. Thomas paused briefly outside the grand office doors, listening for movement. Inside, he could hear muffled voices. King Charles, engaged in discussion with a senior aide, and someone else whose tone was clipped, cautious. He recognized the voice instantly. It was Camilla. She was speaking quietly, but the sharp edge beneath her words betrayed tension. Thomas's stomach tightened. His discovery had not gone unnoticed, or at the very least, the absence of the robe might soon trigger questions. He straightened, adjusted the strap of the carrying case, and prepared himself for the delicate task ahead, presenting the robe to the king without creating a public spectacle or unnecessary confrontation. Inside the office, King Charles looked up as Thomas entered, expression shifting from focused deliberation to mild surprise. "Thomas," he said evenly, "I wasn't expecting you so early. Is everything in order?" Thomas nodded, keeping his posture formal but steady. "Yes, Your Majesty. There is something that requires your attention." He carefully placed the case on a side table, the subtle metallic click of the lock sounding louder than intended in the hush of the room. Charles leaned forward, curious, and gestured for him to continue. Thomas unlatched the case slowly, lifting the coronation robe with reverence, revealing the intricate gold embroidery that shimmered under the morning light. The king's expression shifted immediately. His eyes widened as he took in the delicate, sparkling threads, the emblematic details that had once draped the late queen on the day of her coronation. "By God," he murmured, voice low but full of awe. "I thought that robe was elsewhere." Thomas remained silent, allowing the king to examine the artifact. "It appears someone has kept it hidden," he added carefully, watching for any reaction from Camilla, who stood near the back of the room. Her posture was rigid, hands clasped tightly before her, lips pressed together in a thin line. She did not speak, but her eyes tracked every movement, calculating, assessing. "Hidden?" Camilla's voice was soft, deceptively calm, but there was a sharpness beneath the surface, a controlled fury that Thomas could almost feel pressing toward him. "That is a serious accusation. The robe is my responsibility, a part of my personal collection for safekeeping." Charles's gaze flicked toward her, and a tension settled between the three of them. "Your personal collection?" he asked, tone measured but firm. "This is the coronation robe of the late queen. How could it be considered personal property?" Camilla's eyes narrowed, but she did not respond immediately. She knew better than to speak rashly in front of the king and his most trusted guard. Thomas observed her closely, noting the slight twitch of her fingers, the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes darted from the king to the robe and back again. She was clearly weighing every word, every potential outcome, every accusation. The air in the office felt charged, each subtle gesture magnified. He understood the stakes. Exposing the hidden robe could spark scandal, ignite whispered debates among senior staff, and challenge her carefully curated image within the palace hierarchy. And yet, nothing outweighed the necessity of returning this artifact to its rightful place. Thomas's grip on the case tightened slightly, a reminder to himself that he would not allow fear or intimidation to sway him. Charles turned to Thomas, his voice low but carrying the authority of the crown. "Explain exactly how this came to be in her possession." Thomas inhaled, keeping his composure. "Your Majesty, based on intelligence received through confidential channels, it appears the robe was retained in the Queen Consort's private collection without formal acknowledgement or record. It was concealed behind other garments and storage boxes, suggesting deliberate oversight or precaution." Camilla's lips pressed tighter. "Deliberate oversight?" she repeated sharply. "I was safeguarding it!" Thomas's gaze never wavered. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm and resolute, "this robe is a historic artifact, not a personal possession. Its concealment has deprived the palace and the monarchy of its proper care and recognition. Its discovery today ensures it can be returned to proper custodial authority, preserving its historical significance." Camilla inhaled sharply, her carefully measured composure cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing irritation and frustration. Thomas noted it and remained silent, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. The king's eyes shifted between Camilla and Thomas, processing the situation. "This is troubling," he admitted, brushing a hand over his face in thought. "The robe has immense historical value. To have it hidden, regardless of intent, is unacceptable." Camilla's hands clutched together tightly, as if she might speak, but Charles raised a hand to stop her. "I will handle this delicately," he continued, "but the truth must be acknowledged. Thomas, you did well to discover this before further issues arose." Relief washed subtly over Thomas, though he remained alert, aware that Camilla's reaction could still create tension elsewhere. Camilla finally spoke, her voice even but laced with controlled indignation. "I have only ever intended to protect it. My actions were careful, deliberate, and meant to preserve her memory." Thomas studied her carefully. "With respect, ma'am, preserving memory is best achieved through transparency, not concealment. An artifact of this significance belongs to the monarchy, not to one individual's private collection." Her gaze sharpened, but she said nothing further, recognizing that argument in the presence of the king was futile. Charles gestured toward a secure storage area within the palace, one prepared specifically for artifacts of historical importance. "This robe will be placed here," he said decisively. "It will be documented, preserved, and made available for ceremonial use or viewing as appropriate. No exceptions. And Camilla," he added, voice firmer, "you will have no further authority over its location or handling." Camilla's expression hardened, but she inclined her head in reluctant acknowledgement. Thomas watched the interaction closely, understanding the delicate balance between authority, loyalty, and historical preservation. The tension in the room eased slightly as Thomas carefully lifted the robe, ensuring its intricate patterns remained intact. The weight of history pressed into his hands, a reminder of his responsibility. He felt a quiet pride, knowing that his vigilance had safeguarded a piece of legacy that had survived decades of royal intrigue, concealment, and secrecy. Each careful step toward the secure archive reinforced the truth he had always known. In a palace filled with hierarchy, power struggles, and hidden agendas, the loyalty and integrity of the guards could determine whether history was preserved or lost forever. As they reached the archival room, Thomas gently placed the robe on a specially prepared table, smoothing the silk layers to prevent creases or damage. The golden embroidery shimmered under the soft light, radiating significance and history. Charles nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Thomas. This ensures the late Queen's memory remains honored, and the robe is where it belongs." Camilla stood quietly, the silence heavy with unspoken frustration, but even she could not contest the truth. Thomas allowed himself a brief, quiet exhale, though he remained vigilant, aware that palace intrigue was rarely finished after one revelation. Once the coronation robe was carefully secured in the archival room, Thomas Calder allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, though his instincts remained on high alert. The palace was never truly quiet, and even in this rare lull, the presence of Camilla lingered like a shadow over every hallway. He had returned the robe to its rightful place, yet he knew the act itself would ignite consequences he could not yet foresee. Secrets, once discovered, rarely stayed contained, and Camilla's subtle power within the palace made her a dangerous adversary. Thomas's gaze lingered on the gold embroidery glimmering under the soft archival lights, a tangible reminder of history reclaimed, but also a spark that could ignite hidden conflicts. Camilla's reaction had been muted in the king's presence, but Thomas could sense her calculation behind those carefully composed eyes. Every gesture she made, every breath she drew, was weighed and measured for its potential impact. Once the king left the room, Camilla followed, her footsteps almost imperceptible, yet each one carried authority and unspoken warning. "You have no idea what you've done," she murmured, just low enough for Thomas to hear. Her voice smooth, but edged with menace. He remained calm, his hands clasped behind his back, responding only with measured silence. In the palace, silence was often a more powerful weapon than any word could ever be. The corridors seemed to grow colder as they moved. Camilla's presence was like a current that shifted the air, a subtle influence that made even seasoned staff avert their eyes. Thomas walked a careful distance ahead, ensuring the robe remained secure, while she maintained a faint, deliberate trailing behind him. He had dealt with intrigue before, but this was different. The coronation robe was not just fabric and gold, it was a symbol of legacy, of authority, and of the late queen's memory. And now, Camilla's intentions were clear. She would find a way to reclaim influence over it, either publicly or in whispered strategies behind closed doors. Returning to the king's office, Thomas placed the case on the side table and straightened, acknowledging Charles with a respectful nod. The king, still immersed in paperwork, glanced up briefly, noting the guard's composed stance. "Is it fully secure?" Charles asked, voice calm but loaded with authority. Thomas confirmed, carefully recounting the measures he had taken. The reinforced archival locks, the humidity, controlled environment, and the discreet monitoring that ensured only approved personnel could access the room. Charles's eyes softened slightly, reflecting trust and appreciation. "You've done more than your duty today, Thomas," he said quietly. "The robe is safe, thanks to you." Even as the king's praise settled, Thomas knew the challenge was far from over. Camilla's influence extended beyond the office, seeping into other corridors, staff schedules, and whispered conversations. He was certain she would attempt to manipulate allies within the palace, quietly pressuring individuals who might unknowingly facilitate her plan. As he turned to leave, he noticed her observing him from across the room, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of her lips. Thomas remained composed, masking the tight coil of vigilance that had begun to build in his chest. By mid-morning, rumors of a discovered artifact had begun circulating among the palace staff. Footmen, housekeepers, and aides exchanged subtle glances as Thomas moved through the corridors, each look carrying quiet curiosity and speculation. Camilla's aides whispered in corners, their voices tight and hurried as they tried to explain, justify, or deflect questions about their mistress's unexpected actions. Thomas, noticing every glance and every restrained smile, understood that the real challenge was not overt conflict, but the quiet spread of information. Secrets of this importance could disrupt routines, shift loyalties, and spark whispers that might travel further than intended if not managed carefully. During lunch, Thomas reviewed the archival logs in the small, secure monitoring room, ensuring that access codes were limited and that surveillance measures would provide immediate alerts to any intrusion. Even from this distance, he could sense the ripple of Camilla's influence, a soft, almost imperceptible tremor in palace dynamics. Staff members who had once operated with perfect compliance now hesitated slightly, glancing around as if expecting to see eyes upon them. Thomas's instincts told him that Camilla had begun quietly rallying supporters, testing boundaries, and probing for vulnerabilities in his control over the robe's security. In the afternoon, a sudden knock at the monitoring room door startled him. Thomas opened it to find Princess Anne, her expression sharp and precise, eyes scanning the room as if she were measuring every detail. "I hear there's been a discovery," she said immediately, her tone firm but controlled. "The coronation robe?" Thomas nodded, careful not to over-explain. Anne's eyes narrowed. "Camilla will not take this lightly. She thrives in manipulation, twisting narrative to suit her purposes. You must anticipate her next move." Thomas agreed, detailing the steps already taken to protect the robe. Anne's expression softened slightly, though concern lingered. "This is not merely about an artifact," she said. "It is about legacy, perception, and influence. Be vigilant." Late afternoon brought the first direct challenge. Camilla appeared quietly outside the archival room, ostensibly to inspect unrelated documents, but her presence radiated a subtle assertion of control. Thomas noticed immediately the faint pressure in her stance, the precise tilt of her head, the calculated timing of her entrance. "Guard Calder," she said softly. "I assume everything is in order here." He maintained formal composure, hiding the tension he felt. "Yes, ma'am. All security measures are in place. The robe remains properly preserved." Camilla's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if testing his response. "I only wish to ensure its integrity. One must maintain vigilance with items of such significance." Her tone implied scrutiny, her words a calculated probe rather than concern. Thomas did not allow himself to respond beyond formal acknowledgement. He observed her carefully, noting each subtle gesture. Every second of her presence was measured, every movement deliberate. Camilla left without confrontation, but her departure carried a quiet, unspoken message. She would not be deterred, and she would seek her advantage in the palace hierarchy by exploiting gaps, testing loyalty, or bending rules in subtle ways. Thomas returned to the monitoring logs, watching both surveillance footage and access records with renewed intensity, aware that her next move could happen at any time. Evening descended across the palace as Thomas continued his patrol, walking corridors now shadowed in long, golden light. He reflected on the day's events, the discovery of the late Queen's coronation robe, Camilla's measured responses, and the subtle, almost invisible attempts to assert control over an artifact that did not belong to her. His mind remained alert, calculating possible contingencies, evaluating allies, and preparing for confrontation should it arise. The palace, steeped in history and secrecy, had just revealed another layer of intrigue, and Thomas knew the responsibility of safeguarding legacy rested squarely on his shoulders. By nightfall, Thomas paused in the quiet of the archival hallway, the coronation robe safely secured behind reinforced doors. The soft hum of the palace's ventilation system, the faint rustle of distant footsteps, and the weight of centuries of history pressed upon him. Camilla's presence, though physically absent, was still felt in the tension of the air, the subtle caution in staff behavior, and the knowledge that she would not relinquish influence easily. Thomas knew the battle had only just begun. The search had uncovered history, but protecting it required unwavering vigilance, keen observation, and the unshakable resolve of a guard willing to face intrigue head-on. Night had fallen across the palace, and the corridors were bathed in a soft, golden glow from the chandeliers above, casting shadows that seemed to twist and sway as if alive. Thomas Calder moved carefully, carrying out his final rounds, every step measured, every sense alert. The coronation robe rested securely in the reinforced archival room, yet he could feel the lingering presence of Camilla's influence like a chill in the air. She would not let this go quietly, he knew. Her ambition and skill at manipulation had been honed over decades. Every decision, every subtle glance, every whispered instruction among her staff could ripple into disruption. Thomas's vigilance had to remain unbroken. He paused outside the archival room, checking the locks and sensors one last time before retiring for the evening. The soft click of each latch felt louder than usual, a reassuring rhythm that confirmed the robe's safety. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew the palace was rarely static. Camilla's earlier presence had been deliberate, calculated a probe rather than a confrontation. He could almost predict her next moves, subtle questioning of staff, attempts to plant doubt, or the quiet reshuffling of schedules to create an opening. Thomas exhaled quietly, aware that he had done everything within his control to secure the artifact, but also conscious that safeguarding history required more than simply locking doors. As he walked the corridors toward his quarters, Thomas's attention was drawn to a faint movement near the grand staircase. A figure slipped into the shadows, light, deliberate, and cautious. He paused, adjusting his posture, instinctively moving to intercept. The figure emerged into the golden light, and Thomas recognized her immediately. Camilla, returning despite the late hour, her expression calm yet unreadable, her eyes glinting with determination. "Guard Calder," she said softly, almost conversationally. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I merely wish to ensure all is in order." There was nothing casual about her tone. It was a test, a quiet assertion of her presence and influence. Thomas stood firm, blocking the path between her and the archival room. "Ma'am," he said evenly, voice controlled but firm, "everything is in order. The robe is secure and properly preserved. I cannot allow anyone near it without express authorization." Camilla tilted her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing at her lips. "Authorization? Yes, of course," she said, her words soft, but laced with meaning. "But consider the importance of transparency. History, after all, must be shared, not merely guarded." Her tone was smooth, almost persuasive, but Thomas recognized the subtle threat underlying her elegance. This was no discussion, it was a maneuver. He did not respond, simply observing her every movement. Camilla's eyes flicked over his uniform, his posture, even the shadows cast by the chandeliers. "You are diligent. I will grant you that," she continued, her voice calm, almost conversational. "But remember, even diligence can be redirected. You must consider loyalty. Loyalty to the crown, yes, but also loyalty to those who guide and shape history from behind the scenes." Thomas's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He knew exactly what she meant. She had been subtly weaving influence for years, and her words were carefully crafted to plant doubt, to test compliance, and to assert moral authority where none existed. Without another word, Thomas stepped slightly closer to the archival door, a subtle signal that he would not allow her access. Camilla's eyes narrowed, and she paused, weighing her options. After a tense moment, she withdrew, her movement deliberate, almost theatrical, as if leaving was part of her strategy. Thomas watched her disappear into the shadows near the staircase, every muscle in his body still tense. Even in retreat, she had asserted presence, reminding the palace and him that power could be exerted silently, through suggestion and intimidation. Thomas returned to the archival room one final time, checking the locks, sensors, and surveillance systems. The robe gleamed softly under the controlled lighting, every golden thread reflecting history reclaimed. He allowed himself a small, quiet exhale, acknowledging the weight of responsibility he carried. The late queen's coronation robe was no longer hidden, no longer vulnerable to manipulation, and now resided under vigilant care. Yet Thomas knew that the palace was a living entity, and influence rarely rested in one place for long. Camilla's reach would continue, subtle but persistent, and vigilance had to remain constant. As he exited the room, Thomas encountered Princess Anne once more. Her expression was sharp, focused, and tinged with relief. "Thomas," she said quietly, "Camilla's subtle maneuvers will not end here. You have done well to secure the robe, but be prepared. The palace is watching, and she will test boundaries at every opportunity." Thomas nodded. "Understood, Your Highness," he replied. The quiet confidence in Anne's stance reinforced his determination. Allies like her could ensure that loyalty and integrity within the palace remained unshaken, even as subtle threats lingered like shadows in the corridors. Later that evening, Thomas stood by a window overlooking the palace gardens, the moon casting long silver reflections across the manicured lawns. The events of the day weighed on him. The discovery, the delicate handling of Camilla's presence, and the careful return of the coronation robe to its rightful place. He thought of the late queen, of the significance embedded in each golden stitch, and of the trust placed upon him to safeguard history. The palace, silent and regal beneath the moonlight, seemed to acknowledge his vigilance. Yet he knew the day's events had set new currents in motion. Influence, ambition, and secrecy would continue to swirl, testing the loyalty and discernment of every guard and staff member. Suddenly, a soft rustle reached his ears, almost imperceptible above the night breeze. Thomas's instincts sharpened immediately, every muscle coiling, every sense alert. The shadows in the garden shifted, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the grounds, a figure too tall, too deliberate to be a casual staff member. Thomas's hand brushed the holster at his side, a reflex honed through years of guarding royalty. The palace was quiet, but danger had a subtle way of announcing itself in the smallest details. The discovery of the robe had ended one chapter, but the presence of Camilla and her unseen influence ensured that the story was far from over. He turned from the window and walked back toward the archival room, each step echoing softly against the marble floors. He checked the locks and sensors once more, confirming their integrity. The coronation robe rested undisturbed, safe under his vigilant watch. Thomas allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction, though his mind remained alert. He knew that in the palace, history was fragile, secrets were powerful, and the balance between loyalty and ambition was delicate. The discovery had restored one piece of history, but it had also awakened forces that could challenge stability, manipulate truth, and test his resolve. As the night deepened, Thomas remained near the archival room, a silent guardian in the heart of the palace. The moonlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the gold threads of the coronation robe that now lay safely preserved. In the distance, the faint outline of Camilla's figure could almost be imagined, a reminder of her persistent influence and the subtle challenges yet to come. Thomas knew that vigilance, courage, and integrity would be required in the days ahead. The artifact was secure, history was preserved, and for now, he had won the quiet victory. But the palace, with its secrets, ambitions, and ever-shifting currents, promised that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Thomas would be ready. And somewhere, in the shadows beyond the archival doors, Camilla's presence lingered, silent but potent, a reminder that power rarely sleeps, and history, even when reclaimed, must always be guarded.